Happy Thursday morning, Alabama fans. We are back once again with our show Bammers here, based on the extremely successful and high-quality podcast of the same name, brought to you by its original producer, Ben Flanagan. We're here to do the video version of this, the show where we come to you every week and examine what it means to be an Alabama fan, the experience of it, the highs of it, of which there are many, but also the lows of being a fan of the Crimson Tide. They don't come that often these days, but we're going to have to talk about them today. So I need everybody to get into the headspace of digging deep and going to your dark place as a fan, because today that's what we're doing. And Ben, it's kind of an okay week to talk about that, because as great a year as this has been for Alabama athletics, and it's been one of the best that we can remember, they are coming off of a particularly heartbreaking loss this week with Alabama's exit from the NCAA tournament to UCLA. I think overall the fan base is taking it pretty well, considering.
Yeah, look, if we're being honest, Alabama basketball fans are certainly more used to losing heartbreakers than football fans are.
That's
but
true.
it seems like that's changing now. There seems to be a sea change in the basketball culture in Tuscaloosa. It was an incredible season, a great run, and obviously in the SEC tournament to win the SEC, to win the conference twice over, and then make it to the Sweet 16. That's the mark of a very successful season. And so expectations are going to be high moving forward now, obviously, for Nate Oates and the basketball program. But I think fans will always cherish this past season as one that was just really special.
Yes, and unfortunately has to come to an end in a less than victorious way. But we're going to dig into particularly the football side, I think, today, talking about the most heartbreaking losses that Alabama fans have had to endure. Like I said, haven't been that many of them, but there are some that stand out, and I think a lot of people know which, at least a few of them, that we'll probably be mentioning today. But we want to hear from fans, as always. You guys are a huge part of this show, and as we go through our discussion today, we want you guys to tell us which losses hurt you the most, which ones have stuck with you. And we'll pop them up on screen, like this one from Zurich Foreman, who says LSU beating us, celebrating on our field and winning the Natty, but they paid for their sins. Usually there does end up being some form of vengeance that comes for Bama fans. They haven't had too many unavenged losses, but yeah, let's get into these today. That one's pretty fresh. The one that Zurich mentioned there of LSU winning in 2019. So it's almost hard to know how much it's going to sting over time. But let's get into a few of them, Ben. What's the first one on your list that you want to bring up?
Let me just start by saying, it's so funny to relive losses from the Saban era, because as you've mentioned, they're so rare. But the best part about it for me is that fans can remember them in the most vivid detail. It's certainly not a fun list to make, nor are they fun memories to remember. But given all the success that Alabama has enjoyed these last 15 years, basically, I think we'll be fine. And I think it's healthy to talk about it. We mentioned the Bammers podcast. I did an episode about how Alabama fans cope with losing, because they treat it like this very traumatic event. And so I spoke to this sports psychologist about it, and just about, what people do to deal with it. Since it's so rare, the impact is just so heavy. And my number 5, I think a lot of people won't really remember this one as one of the heavier losses, but just looking back, it symbolized a lot for me. And I've got 2007 from that season, which was Nick Saban's first, the LSU game. And there's obviously a much more infamous loss from the 2007 season that most people would probably point to as one of the worst of the Saban era. But for me, the loss to LSU in Bryant-Denny Stadium was a little more deflating overall in terms of what it signified. Alabama had this full head of steam going into the game. They had just smacked Tennessee about 41-17, I think the score was. They had a lot of momentum before hosting number 3 LSU, who were obviously poised to have a big season. And it looked good for Alabama late in the game. when Javier Arenas ran back a punt for a touchdown. The place was it was electrifying. The place was just as loud as it's ever been. But LSU just overpowered Alabama to close the game, including a nasty sack and I think maybe a fumble of John Parker Wilson, a touchdown from Early Doucette. And the reason this one hurt, Matt, was because it basically told Alabama that you're not quite ready for the big time yet. It won't be long, obviously, but it's going to be a minute at least this season. And as we would find out the next season too, when Florida beat them in the SEC championship. But the LSU loss, after all that momentum, and I think Alabama may have been like 6-2 going into the game, that started a brutal 4-game losing streak, which was the end of a tough season. Nobody expected Nick Saban to win the national championship or really compete for one during his first season. But when they picked up all that momentum about halfway through, it certainly felt like they could be onto something.
Yeah, I mean, that 2007 season is I think most people look back on it and remember that it had that Louisiana Monroe loss, it had the Iron Bowl loss, but those are the low points, right? I mean, and it did ultimately end on a low point, and I think the takeaway most people had from that season, as you said, is Alabama's not there yet. They're not ready. There's still a lot of work to do. But there was a point in that LSU game that you're mentioning that it didn't feel that way, and that there was this brief moment where Bama fans thought, we're already there. We've made this transformation this quickly. And it really was that Arenas punt return for a touchdown. It was a huge moment. It felt like a very momentous thing, and ultimately got washed away pretty quickly. But, I do think I think that's an interesting one that it is this high on the list. I haven't seen anybody else in the comments mentioning this one specifically so far, but it's definitely one that I think took the wind out of the sails for the program, at least until the 2008 season started, which we've talked about that on this show before. That pretty much undid all of the pain of 2007 immediately. Ben, I've got one a little bit further back on my list that I think a lot of these will start to become more familiar to fans because they particularly stung the ego of Bama fans for a little while. My number 5 on my list is the 2014 Sugar Bowl versus Ohio State, which was, I think, look, you don't want to lose to Ohio State if you're a Bama fan. There's definitely a lot of pride wrapped up in playing other blue-collar programs. So that part of it hurts. But I think really the thing that hurt the worst about this game was it was in the playoffs. And Alabama, this was really the first time that they'd been in a position to play their way into a national championship and came up short, didn't get the job done. And, I think that 2014 team was in some ways overachieved. They were trying to figure out an identity that I think eventually the program took on. But in 2014, they weren't quite consistent with it yet. They hadn't totally figured out how to do that, how to become the sort of high-scoring offensive juggernaut that we now have seen them fully grow into.
Yeah, it was tough because, that started, I think, a 3-year streak of first-year starters at quarterback with Blake Sims there. But look, Matt, I've got this game, the Ohio State game, as my number 2. This one hurt bad because of the stakes that you mentioned. And Alabama and the SEC, they're all about bragging rights. The SEC is so much better than everybody else, especially other blue bloods like Ohio State and whoever from the Big Ten. And so when all that noise is out there, it really backfires on the fans when their SEC team loses, in this case, Alabama. And Alabama looked like they were going to dominate this game early on. I think they went up 20-7 pretty early, and it really felt like almost a done deal at that point. It was going to be another blowout. Alabama was going to play for the national championship. But they may have eased up off the gas pedal a little bit. And Ohio State's freshman quarterback, Cardell Jones, he settled down after some early jitters. And Ezekiel Elliott just ran all over the defense, which maybe wasn't the all-time best unit in the Saban era, but still, it was an onslaught. It was tough to watch. And Saban's teams, they don't go down without a fight, though. They kept it close thanks to the efforts of Blake Sims and sophomore backup running back Derrick Henry, and it looked like they may have made a comeback pretty late with this nifty play to O.J. Howard in the red zone before Ohio State snuffed it out, and they intercepted it, and they just ended the momentum. And this one hurt, to me, way worse than those Sugar Bowl losses to Utah in 2008 and Oklahoma in 2013, or even the Cam Newton Iron Bowl, because this was the big stage. Like, this was for the national title, and Ohio State beat them fair and square, and they could hold it over Alabama's heads for the next 7 years. And obviously Alabama, righted that wrong this past year, but it's been a long 7 years to be sure.
Yep, I agree with you on it being a bigger deal than the other Sugar Bowls, even though the other ones I think were disappointing and to some degree humiliating. It always hurts more when it knocks you out of the potential of winning a national title. All right, what's next on your list, Ben?
So my number 4 is probably number 1 for a lot of people, and I understand that. Mine's the Kick Six, the Iron Bowl from 2013. And look, one team's all-time greatest play is another team's all-time catastrophe. It's up there with the top plays in sports history, let alone this rivalry or even college football. The Kick Six dashed Alabama's hopes at an undefeated season, a third straight national championship. I mean, Alabama was really going for history that year, and I know it hurt a lot of people when that happened. And while Alabama stars like A.J. McCarron and T.J. Yeldon and Amari Cooper, they put up big stats in the game, the offense really struggled on third down, converting on just, I think, 4 of 13 attempts. A.J. McCarron threw this 99-yard go-ahead touchdown bomb pass to Amari Cooper early in the fourth quarter, and it looked like it might seal the deal for Alabama and they would escape. But with just 30 seconds left, Nick Marshall hit Sammy Coates for just this heartbreaking touchdown to tie it up, which has become controversial in the eyes of a lot of Alabama fans. But it happened. It counted. Auburn tied the game, and the stakes couldn't have been higher with Alabama playing for, again, a shot at an undefeated season, third straight trip to a BCS championship. And Auburn gladly just swooped in to dominate Missouri in the conference title game. And they would obviously fall short in the national championship game, which for me, Matt, that's why this one is a little bit lower on my list. It's a little easier to swallow because I know that Auburn didn't win the national championship in this case. So it made it a little bit easier, even though it stung really bad. And look, Alabama had won 2 national championships prior to that. So, we won it all, but we can't have it all.
Look, I know this is the last conversation that a lot of Alabama fans want to have, but let me bring up another one while we're talking about this, because it's interesting to me that this one is lower for you than the 2010 Iron Bowl, right? Which I've sort of got those two flip-flop, and I want to sort of ask you, because to me, I would say the 2013 Iron Bowl is arguably tougher to take, because Alabama could have won their own national championship had they won that game. It in some ways it cost Alabama a potential national championship, whereas I don't think the 2010 game did. Alabama's season, in terms of their quest for a national title that year, it was already done. They couldn't win the West. They had lost to LSU already. They were really knocked out of contention at that point. So, I guess that would be my counter side to it, is what it cost Alabama. Whereas it seems like for you, the fact that Auburn converted that Iron Bowl win into their own national title is what made 2010 worse.
Yeah, so I've had a lot of arguments with friends about which Iron Bowl loss hurt worse, and I've got Cam Newton in this Iron Bowl at number 3, ahead, just one spot above the 2013, the Kick Six game. And again, it comes down to the Kick Six or the Cam Newton game. And they picked the Kick Six for the reasons that you just said. It ended Alabama's hopes for a third straight national championship. The season was on the line, whereas in 2010, Alabama already had 2 losses, and they were out of the national title picture. They weren't in contention. They were playing for pride. The tables had sort of turned where Auburn was playing for more this time, instead of the Iron Bowl being an obstacle for them. Whereas for Alabama, it's their entire focus. They can play spoiler, and this can sort of save the season in the eyes of a lot of fans. But in the moment, Matt, The 2010 game hurt worse. If I'm comparing what the moments felt like, we can talk about the scope of it, the macro view of it, and I understand that argument. But for me, I was in the stadium for both of them. The kick six was more of a freak accident, in my opinion, where you ripped off the Band-Aid and you were in shock. You didn't really understand what had just happened. The next thing you knew, you were just walking out of the stadium.
So,
right?
so 2010 is Head in Hands or
Yes.
the Surrender Cobra.
So
2013 is that, right?
Yeah, it's over. Like, so the Cam Newton game was more. It was more like death by a thousand cuts. You know what I'm saying? Like it unfolded slowly in real time. All of these ominous moments had happened where you knew that it was sort of bound to happen and go south. Like, we know Alabama opened up a huge lead. Mark Ingram's playing well. McElroy is hitting Julio Jones for a bomb touchdown pass. I think they went for like 80 yards in the first quarter or first half. The defense had Cam Newton bottled up. Courtney Upshaw's playing out of his mind. And not that anyone really knew what was going to happen after Alabama opened up, a 24-0 lead. It did feel a little too good to be true in the moment. Like, this is just too easy. Cam Newton's too good. Why is Alabama just dominating like this? And I think it was the touchdown pass early in the second half where Cam Newton hit Terrell Zachary for 70 yards, where it looked like Alabama safety Mark Barron had the play read, but just couldn't make a play on the ball. We learned later after the fact that he was a little bit injured, but after that, it just all unraveled. And I think it was, again, Matt, the way it all unfolded. Cam Newton, like the name I think triggers a lot of Alabama fans, and for good reason. I mean, maybe and still is arguably the biggest villain in Alabama history, right?
He's like up there for sure.
Yeah, Alabama fans certainly do not want to see Auburn succeed at anything, let alone go undefeated, win a Heisman, and then a national championship. And again, the kick six hurt. Like, it hurt bad, but it softened the blow a bit for me when they lost to Florida in the national championship game. But it was such a blow because if Alabama can't win a national championship, which is the case in 2010, why does it have to be Auburn instead of Alabama? So, yeah, it hurts just talking about it, Matt, thinking about it.
It's the worst case scenario for many Bama fans, for sure. So let's move on from Iron Bowl losses. We've hit there's no way there's going to be another Iron Bowl on this list, because there's no way that any of them hurt worse for Bama fans than 2013 or 2010. So what else do you have remaining on your list at this point to talk about?
I've just got my number one loss.
Well, drop your number one on me.
Okay, number one. I never thought I would see this, but the 2018 national championship game against Clemson, even more so than the 2016 game when Deshaun Watson just dominated, and Alabama obviously kept it close, but didn't have an answer for them in their offense. The 2018 game, speaking of not having an answer, it was just a total beatdown in every sense of the word. After Tua's opening drive pick six, opening play, I think, pick six, again, it became ominous from that point on. Like, Alabama rebounded with a deep pass to Jerry Jeudy for a touchdown, tied the game. I think Alabama fans certainly felt a little better at that point. And Alabama was even up 16-14 in the first half. So I think a lot of people thought it's okay. Alabama's offense is just that good. Alabama's still going to win this game. They probably all thought Alabama would still win. But as the game went on, I mean, it was clear that they just had no answer for Trevor Lawrence and Clemson's just explosive receivers. Alabama's offense couldn't convert in the red zone, and it was just a big mess in one of those losses that you just never saw up to that point under Nick Saban. Like, they're usually like ready for prime time. They play their best on the biggest stage, but it just wasn't their night that night. And everybody remembers how special that season was, though. Like, it doesn't take away from just how incredible and entertaining that offense was to watch, or that whole team was to watch, because they dominated the entire year up to that point. Again, those receivers, Mike Loxley's play calling, just scoring at will against anyone and everyone. It was a real sight to behold, and it gave fans a lot of memories that they'll cherish forever. I know it just wasn't meant to be in the national championship. Alabama just got their butts kicked by 28 points. I mean, fans finally felt what Notre Dame felt in 2012, right? Alabama was so proud of humiliating a blue blood program.
Yeah,
Exactly. They were just so proud of humiliating a blue blood opponent like that by 28 points. And then here's Alabama in the same boat just a few years later. But again, right at the wrong. Alabama's back on top, but it was hard to watch, Matt.
I would say that, and it's hard. It's been so long since that happened. It seems like at this point, but I was there for that game. I remember just it was bizarre to watch. I mean, everything about it, including the fact that it was thousands of miles away from either school that was playing in it. It was sort of a surreal scene to see Alabama get blown out, which is a thing we have never seen under Nick Saban and still haven't since then. That's the only time it's happened. And, the equivalent would be like if you can put yourself a couple months ago and try and imagine what it would have been like for Alabama to do what they did all season this year and then get absolutely crushed by Ohio State in the national title game. It would have been really hard to get your head around. It would have been deflating. And that's really what that was that season. It not only was disappointing, but I think for a lot of people at the time made people question, not for the first time and probably not for the last time, is this sort of the end of the road for Alabama under Nick Saban? Is this finally where they can't keep up anymore? They've been surpassed somehow. And of course, that turned out to be wrong, just like it has been every other time. But at the time, it really felt like a crisis for the program. I mean, to see Clemson doing what they did in that game, I mean, I still haven't heard a good explanation for why it happened. It seems like it just was a collision of everything was working for Clemson that day and just nothing seemed to work for Alabama going into that game. So and you think about too the other side of this. I know you just talked about that the Iron Bowl losses can hurt worse because of who benefits from it, because it's Auburn that's benefiting from it. In this case, I think Clemson had already become kind of a rival to Alabama, and this game was a huge deal for them. I would say that Clemson, in many ways, is still riding high from what they did in that 2018 national title game.
What I remember the most is just like Trevor Lawrence was like the Terminator out there. And like it just seemed like, well, this guy's here to stay for at least the next 2 years after this. Who's going to beat this team, right? Like they're just going to keep riding this wave of momentum. And they're already at a point where they seem to be on par with Alabama in terms of talent, consistency. Dabo Swinney, I know, has his critics out there, especially within the Alabama fan base. But it seemed like everything was clicking on all cylinders for that program. And they've obviously had success since then, too, going back to the national title game the next year and then going back to the playoff this past year. Alabama has, I wonder if Alabama fans feel fortunate that they didn't get the rematch, right? They didn't have to play Trevor Lawrence again, either of those 2 seasons. But I think some of them probably did want proper revenge against Dabo in that squad while he was there. But that era is over now, and Alabama has won a national title since then. So I think they feel fine about it. But just the nature of the loss, again, a near 30-point loss in a national title game, it was just something I just never thought I would see at Alabama, especially under Nick Saban. But it obviously can happen to anybody, but it doesn't mean it's the end of the era. Alabama proved that. So Alabama fans, I think, probably feel fine about it. But man, you're right. It was surreal. It felt like Bizarro World almost watching it.
Will we ever get to a point? I mean, are Alabama fans learning enough over time? And it's not just the fans. I'll put this on the media too. Are we going to reach a point where the benefit of the doubt that Alabama gets is so substantial that something like that happening, or even a whole season that's disappointing, doesn't lead to people saying, is it over? Is it over? That people will just sort of automatically assume, well, Alabama will be back from wherever they are right now.
Well, it's funny, Matt. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Alabama's losses. Like if you go back and watch most of those losses, the ones we've mentioned, like the Ohio State game, like the Auburn games, like the Ole Miss losses from a couple of seasons, sure, 2014, 2015, even the Oklahoma Sugar Bowl. I mean, Alabama just never goes quietly, right? Like they're always in it. They're always fighting tooth and nail. Like you've really got to take them out to take them out. It's not over till it's over. I think that's true also for Nick Saban's dynasty that he's created. I think people make the weird assumption that he's not adaptable. That Nick Saban is just like this old fogey who sees, football as one certain thing and it has to work that way or else it doesn't work at all. And this past season, a big narrative was that Nick Saban changed with the times and he did it better than anybody did. He did the thing that was beating him better than anybody else had up to that point and put the best possible offense that you could have out there on the field and just dominated everybody to a point where it almost seemed like it wasn't even fair or competitive. So he adapts. That's what great coaches do. That's what great strategic sports minds do. So, it's up to everybody else to keep up now and put him in that vulnerable position again. Not to say that won't happen.
I do think probably the first sign, and look, I've done it too. I've had my doubts after big losses for Alabama over the years. I think probably I've learned at this point that I will start to be concerned about the future of the program at Alabama when they stop recruiting the way that they're recruiting. And there's no sign of that right now. They just signed an incredible recruiting class, maybe the best one that they've had. And it's you can be beaten when you have superior talent, but it's real tough. I mean, if you're that much better than everybody else just in terms of your players, people have to overcome a lot to beat you. So
Did you think it was over? Did you think it was over after the Clemson game? Did you, not that it was over? Did you think like this could be the beginning of the end?
I think that's probably one of the only times that I did think it was after that 2018 title game. Just because, I think I could convince myself that the championship from the year before, because they won the national championship the year before that. And there's people like me already asking, is it over? But it felt like they really had to scrape it out. It took a lot of things going Alabama's way in 2017 for them to win the title. They sort of backed their way into the playoffs. And then when they get to the national championship game, they have to change quarterbacks at halftime. It felt weird. It didn't feel like a domination, but it was impressive nonetheless. But it's sort of, I guess I sort of convinced myself, yeah, maybe this defense part of it is going to be a problem that maybe Saban can't fix. And of course, what we've seen is that the answer is, I do think the defense has gotten better to some degree, but I think bigger than that is they figured out, and you hear Nick Saban say it, he's said it this spring already, defense is just different now. You're not going to see defenses that average allowing 6 points a game anymore in college football. You can't win a national championship that way. And so he himself, I think, has accepted that and built the offense differently to accommodate for that. And I think that's one of many reasons why Nick Saban gets paid $10 million a year and I don't, because he saw how to fix that problem.
Yeah, I think people were focusing on the wrong thing at the time, including me, where it's like my big question was, how is Alabama going to stop an offense like this? How are they going to stop them? And I was thinking from the defensive perspective, because Nick Saban is a defensive guy, right? Like that's what you think. He's going to mold dominant defenses to stop good offenses, but it just seemed impossible. Nobody was thinking, well, he's just going to learn how to outscore these teams, not stop them. He's going to just pile points onto them. Even when Alabama had such a dominant offense in 2018, it's amazing that they could just reach even newer heights after that. So it's an impressive coaching, as if we need to say that Nick Saban did something impressive as a coach, but it was an impressive new trajectory, I think, for his career.
For sure. So we're ending this discussion on a high point here. Because it is called Bammers, but I just wanted to run a couple of quick ones in here from commenters. Edward Hill giving us a big throwback here, which we appreciate as younger guys. The 1973 Sugar Bowl loss he brings up to Notre Dame. It was a 1-2 game that Notre Dame won. I know a lot of Bama fans, those Notre Dame losses sting, and that's part of why that 2012 game was so fun for a lot of fans, because it was one of the few programs that Bear Bryant sort of didn't get a one-up on it at any point. Pete here wanted to actually bring up the 9-6 LSU game from 2011, a regular season game that Alabama got revenge for in the same season.
Still
but that
hurt,
one's
right?
still hurting
Yeah.
to Pete. I mean, it definitely was brutal on the night because it was the build up to that game. I don't think we'll ever see anything like that again.
So any time Alabama loses, the feeling is the season has just slipped out of our fingers, right?
Yeah.
Our season is over. We're not going to win the national championship this year. And I think in Alabama needed help after that to sneak back into the BCS picture. Obviously, thanks Oklahoma State, appreciate that. But anytime they lose, it's just the worst possible feeling. Anytime another team scores a touchdown, Matt, if Alabama's up by 40
it's
points,
over.
Yeah, if Alabama's up by 40 points and the other team scores a touchdown, take a look around in the stadium and look at the faces on people. It is like their dog just died in front of them. Like, awful.
Yeah.
Awful.
I've got another one up here from a friend of ours, Ben, who says the worst loss was LSU 2005. It was the last chance I gave them to get back to the glory of Bear. After that, I never watched another Bama game because I knew we'd never succeed again. So a little bit of a over dramatic reaction there, probably from our friend.
He's right. He's right.
But I will say the LSU 2005 game was very crushing. Alabama was, I believe, number 3 in the country going into that game. So in the BCS era, that means you're knocking on the door of getting into the national title game. And it was for the SEC West, which was something that Alabama had not achieved since 1999 at that point, which felt like a long time. And it was a similar. I wouldn't say it was at the level of 2011, but it was a very heavily hyped game. Game day was there. It was a big deal, and Alabama just kind of never really was in it. I think they pulled it close in the second half.
Well, so the way I remember it was, so my wife cried at this game. She was upset about it too because it was an overtime loss. It was an overtime loss where I think
overtime. You're right. Yeah.
So this was when Jamarcus Russell hit, I think, Dwayne Bowe in the end zone for overtime. So Alabama's up 10-0 in the first half. Going into halftime, Alabama's up 10-0. Second half, it flips on it. LSU wins that half 10-0. So it's 10-10 going into overtime. Alabama kicks a field goal in overtime to go up 13-10, I believe. But then that's when Jamarcus Russell, obviously future first-round pick, hits Bowe in the end zone, ends it in walk-off fashion. It was brutal. It was brutal.
And then Alabama just sort of, as often happened back then, the LSU loss turns into an Iron Bowl loss. And
oh man, bad one too.
Man, and that was a good season for Alabama in the Mike Shula era. 2005 was a highlight. So
man.
Definitely a rough one. So thanks to Graham for bringing that up. We did not end up getting to as many of the Facebook comments today as I normally would like to because the software we're using here, for some reason, was not pulling in Facebook comments. So apologies to everybody who commented on Facebook today. We'll get that fixed and get you guys up on screen more next week when we come back. But thanks to everybody.
I was going to say, I bet people are dropping 2010 South Carolina.
I bet so.
2008 Florida. I didn't include any losses where Alabama went on to win the national championship because they won the national championship. How sore can you be over those losses? But those Ole Miss losses in 2014 and 15, those were terrible.
A few people have brought up the Ole Miss losses today, and I get that because I think to some degree, just like it hurts in a unique way because of Auburn losing to Auburn because of everything about that rivalry. There's a specific flavor to losing to Ole Miss because I think Alabama fans feel like that should never happen. We are clearly a better program than Ole Miss. That should not happen.
It almost happened last year. I mean, as dominant as Alabama was, that Ole Miss game was it was kind of like that 2009 Tennessee game. Not fun, like memorable, but not fun in the least. So I understand that. But we go back to that idea of like villains. I mentioned Cam Newton was like one of the biggest villains in Alabama football history. I think in recent memory, like Hugh Freeze, Ryan Kelly, Bo Wallace, those names are probably villains in the eyes of a lot of Alabama fans. So it did not feel good to lose to those guys.
And Lane Kiffin, after initially entering the Alabama fan universe as a villain, and then doing a face turn and becoming the guy who transformed the offense at Alabama, has now done another heel turn and potentially could be one of the great villains of the next several years. We'll see how things go.
He will be, like, no doubt. But again, the Ole Miss losses, the first one, Alabama still goes to the college football playoff. They lose, but they still made it. The second one, they go to the playoff, they win the championship. And then obviously with Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss team, they win the national championship. But it reminds me of like the Texas A&M loss to Johnny Manziel, which I'm sure was on a lot of people's lists too. That was a tough one to watch. Alabama still won the national championship that season. So it usually turns up roses for Alabama if you can just be patient and just try to see the big picture. But when you're in the midst of a loss, Matt, nothing else matters. You're losing, and the world just is piling on top of you. So it's understandable.
Well, thanks to everybody who showed up today to help to process your grief as we enter the springtime here. It's looking beautiful outside. This is a safe time to explore these feelings. So I'm glad we all got to do this together. We'll have a much more upbeat topic for you guys next week on Bammers. But Ben, thanks as always for joining me, and thanks to all of our audience members who contributed to the show today. We really always appreciate what you guys do to help make this show fun. So thanks to everybody, and we will see you again next week.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter, everybody.